Fantastic. Thanks so much. So I'm Alison Chapman, as Ariane said. I'm the lead officer for trauma within South Lanarkshire Council. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the approach that we've taken and what we've sort of found through that approach, if you like. So I started with South Lanarkshire in June 22, and really there'd been quite a significant range of foundational work already done by the time I came into my post, which was really, really beneficial. And that had included a real focus on training and a lot of momentum around it. So I was really keen to maintain that and really build on what was already there. So I've listed some of the things there just that I knew had happened within 21. So there was a range of training, even up to the enhanced level at that point around safety and stabilisation, predominantly for our social work staff at that point. But we also had a range of people attend one of the early online stilt sessions as well. Again, social work were the front runners there, but also from education, from housing, and our finance and corporate resource as well, which was great. There were also a couple of trauma champions already in place, and there had been sessions already done for elected members, integrated joint boards. There were papers that had gone to CMT, and our leadership pledge, which was signed in 2021 as well, made a really clear statement around, we will ensure that the National Trauma Training Programme, as it was then, is a priority in our learning and development programme in recognition of the need to highlight trauma being everyone's business. So that was really significant, having that in place, and that all happened before our steering group had met for the first time. There'd also been consideration given into groups of staff that don't traditionally maybe align with your thinking around trauma-informed practice, and that was our facilities staff, cleaning staff, catering staff, concierge, school crossing patrols, school meals, things like that. And they had included, as part of a mandatory learning course, they'd incorporated those, the opening doors and sewing seats videos at that point, alongside information on attachment, children's rights, gender-based violence. So it was really understood, within that context, and didn't require having to create separate learning. And then into 2022, there were 6 of the NTTP learning resources had been added to our learning platform at that point. And that was a range of different learning materials there. And they'd also just had, literally a few weeks before I started, a Learning at Work week. The focus of that was an online thing, but the focus on that, or the theme of that, sorry, was big things that impact all that we do. And again, trauma-informed practice was, mentioned in there, that South Lanarkshire Council was on that journey, that we wanted to become a trauma-informed and responsive organisation, and it was alongside things like corporate parenting and the promise and things as well. So all of this work really made it quite easy for me to slip into that post when I started, and in keeping with that focus, my post sits within the learning and development team for social work, and I attend all of the social work L&D liaison groups as well, which has been incredibly useful for my own learning, as I don't have a social work background. It's been invaluable for developing relationships, and has really helped facilitate the majority of my work, which has been mainly with social work, and you see quite a few examples of that on the screen there. So it was really about inputting to existing forums or courses or events that were already there, so that we weren't creating additional work, we weren't separating this out from people's other work that they were doing. So social work inductions, manager development programs, mental health officer forums, public protection courses. I provide an input into 3 different courses that run throughout that year on a regular basis. We deliver workshops to our adult and older people day centres. Our family support hubs receive those workshops and are supported by a reflective practice coordinator, who is one of our sort of more informal trauma champions, being a trauma counsellor herself. We've done work with justice services as well, a lot of staff development sessions for the unpaid work staff there. And trauma-informed practice really became required learning for all of social work staff, and it sits on their learning matrices. And from attending the resource management teams across all the resources, not just social work, in sort of mid-2023, speaking to those directors and heads of service, we got agreement there that all staff in the council, sort of over an 18-month period, which I think was a wee bit ambitious, given we've got 16,000 staff, but we would work towards all staff having completed a level of foundational knowledge around trauma-informed practice. And at the same time, I've also been really heavily promoting the STILT webinar for our leaders, and really aiming that at operational leaders and above, not the most senior people, who it can be very challenging for them to attend 3-hour sessions. But we've managed to, through a lot of heavy promotion of that, get quite a lot of people through the STILT webinar. And having what's really facilitated that and made that easier is having a full year of dates ahead of time, to be able to promote that, to be able to support people to plan who's going to attend when. And it's also allowed me to organise regular follow-up workshops with our TPTIC as well, which has really taken on some momentum and traction now, which is fantastic. And we've continued to expand the learning that we've been able to offer people. We've recently added the 4 skilled level modules onto our learning platform as well. We have a very small trauma skilled trainers network that we've recently established, and our housing services colleagues who've really embraced a lot of this training and utilised their monthly development sessions to give people the space to complete that learning. They've undertaken the Transforming Connections training, and they're now considering, having somebody trained from within housing services to co-deliver that training going forward. So you kind of got a sense maybe there from that race through of all that the approach that we've taken, firstly, has been very highly informed by the fact we have no budget. So it's been about making really good use of the resources that are available. And that's particularly around the national resources, but also those internal resources, and trying to grow those allies and those champions with, a small c within the organisation. And it's really been about building on the progress and momentum that was already there. And then, as I said, incorporating a lot of learning into existing events and programmes. Keeping that on the agenda, it helps that our steering group members, the representatives on there, also sit on our L&D boards as well. And because I attend the social work L&D groups as well, we're helping to keep that in people's awareness. It's always talked about, it's always considered, and really helps with embedding that. Also helps that I sit within a team of ex-social workers, so I have access to their knowledge and their networks as well, which has made a massive difference, actually. It's not all called training. This is kind of a personal thing for me. I refer to things a lot of the time as an input, a workshop, a development day, a presentation. It's not always delivered in a way that I would call training. It doesn't have the finality of that word training, where people can really see it as a sense of one and done. This is more about offering people reflective space, the chance to have a conversation about this and what this really means for them within their roles. What it's also not been is a very overly planned approach, I'll be honest. I haven't been working from a really concrete plan up until this point. There has been a lot of responding and reacting to things, which has, it works to a point. But I'm seeing now that, given we've raised that awareness and we've built that momentum, that's becoming more difficult to then be able to respond to all the requests that may come through. So as of early next year, we do have some formal planning sessions in place with each of our resources. And we've also got a new learning OD and diversity manager who started as well, who I've linked in with before she'd even started, really, because I need to have that support for a more organisational approach. I need a wider range of people who are championing trauma-informed practice across the organisation, so that it's not seeing us just sitting within those traditional people services like social work or education. And also, it's been about taking advantage of those opportunities as they arise. The main one for me this year was really that the NTTP workforce survey. I just saw that as the best promotional opportunity going at that point, because it was something that could go out to all of our staff, but it also allowed us to get some data back as well, given that we haven't surveyed our staff on this. we'd have some data to work with, and it also just allowed us to continue or even just start that dialogue with some people. And we had a really large response actually to that survey. There was about 1,400 people in South Lanarkshire that responded to the survey, which was way beyond what I expected, despite a huge amount of promotion that we had done. This was far exceeded those expectations. They weren't all council employees, I have to say. It was people who worked within South Lanarkshire, within public sector, so there was a range of people within that. But what we found looking at these results for South Lanarkshire is maybe a wee bit small for people to see, but the two graphs that are on the left are people's self-assessment of their understanding of the concept of psychological trauma and the impact of psychological trauma. And you can see the green and the orange bars there are the biggest, and those are really around either very confident in orange or somewhat confident in their understanding in the green. And so that's sort of where I would hope to see things. It's encouraging to see that people do feel they've got a level of understanding given the amount of training and learning that has taken place. But the two bar charts on the right-hand side, you'll see there's a slightly different profile in those. We'll see that the blue and the purple bars are larger, or they're larger than the other two graphs. And this is really where people are feeling not so confident or not at all confident. And this was around understanding of the principles of trauma-informed practice and the confidence in applying those principles. And I think that fits with where we would kind of expect to be at this point. You know, it's relatively quick and easy to raise understanding and awareness around trauma and its impact, and people have a lot of existing knowledge that they've already got around that, but it does take longer to build that confidence for people. And there's also so many organisational factors that are impinging as well onto what people can do within their roles. So what this kind of said to me was there's a real need there to focus on those principles and really bring those to life for people. I really aim to do that within the in-person workshops that we deliver, but it's perhaps not coming through as strongly in the e-learning provision. So it was a good piece of learning for me in terms of where we might need to put a bit more focus in there. Something that we did do as a local authority, we've got really large numbers of staff that work out in the community. They're not sitting at a desk, they're not accessing e-learning, and South Lanarkshire Council does love e-learning. There is a lot of it. So we took that learning out to them. So Mind Your Head was a joint trauma and mental health awareness campaign that we ran end of last year, beginning of this, for our property services manual workforce. So that's the tradespeople that are working, going into the homes of council tenants, so a lot of quite vulnerable people. And this was run collaboratively with L&D, Employee Wellbeing and Unite the Union. And what we did was we delivered 14 face-to-face sessions across the 3 different depots, and these were early winter mornings. But this really was about going out and literally meeting people where they were, because this is where they start their working day, and they maybe don't come back to that depot again for the rest of that week, or depending on what they're doing. And this was about talking to people about what this means for them. So we gave that introduction to trauma-informed practice to the NTTP. We showed the opening doors animation, and then we facilitated group discussions on the content of that and the themes that were there for people, and also had wellbeing there as well to be able to talk about the information that's available, the support that's available, and how to signpost people onto those wellbeing supports. Also, importantly, able to provide that one-to-one support in that moment as well if people really felt they wanted or needed that at that time. And there was huge learning that came out of this actually for us. We did run some sort of pre and post rating scales that we asked people to complete, and we did see an increase in people's understanding, but it was more, the real quality stuff was really around what was being discussed, that feeling of a real lack of physical or psychological safety. And these roles, joiners and plumbers, are not really something that is probably expected as part of that role, to be encountering the sort of impact of trauma, but this is what they are facing on a very, very regular basis. So that was really useful to hear, and also because it allows us to report that back and feed that back to management as well about where people are feeling at this point. And we've got a lot of support from that, and we're going to be running a second phase early next year so that we can reach more people and sort of expand the scope of that. and also with a view to replicating it with other workforces that are similarly working out in the community. And I have to say that one of the most useful things around this was the fact that we had branded this. It had its own identity, which made it really easy to communicate about. We created a logo for it. We created materials, banners, posters, things that we can reuse as well, because they weren't specific to certain dates and things like that. So it was a really, really useful, I think, process to go through in terms of how to reach out to those people who are not accessing the learning in a way that we maybe ask other people to do. We have had a lot of challenges around this. Lack of budget is obviously right there. It means we can't procure any additional, bring in additional learning and resources and things like that. We've also had a new HR and payroll system come in just very recently in the last 2 months that has a learning component to it, but there's limitations with that system. And so it means that our trauma courses are currently sitting under the social care section, which is not an obvious place for a lot of people. It's an obvious place, for people who work within social care to go for that learning, but not for others. And it really isn't in keeping with this idea of trauma being everybody's business. So we need to do some work around how we can reposition the learning or reorganise that. We've also lost some key people. 2 of our trauma skilled trainers that sat within my own team have left this year, so that pool has dramatically shrunk. And as a result of retirement, I've lost my 3 main sponsors of the Mind Your Head campaign as well. So, and this is something that's going to happen. 41% of our staff are between 50 and 65 years old, and we won't be unusual in that in a staff profile for a local authority. So it's really about having that, not overly relying on individual people. We've had an ongoing debate around whether the training should be mandatory. Manual worker, people working in those sort of manual areas, they've been keen to have that mandated because that's been their approach. And we may go down that route because that suits that area, but we certainly haven't said that it's mandatory. Use that language for everybody else. And there's also that tension between wanting to provide a bespoke, tailored approach to people and content with the volume of staff that we have as a local authority. So just as a final slide, then some really hard to kind of pull together some key learning. There's so much in here, but for me, one of the key pieces there was not overloading people with learning options. I think perhaps initially we had a feeling of more is more, and we really just had too many courses and they weren't laid out as clear pathways or programs. So people didn't really know where to start. Some people did everything. Some people, I think, just felt stuck and didn't know what to engage with. And so with that new system that we have, we're hoping to organise those in a more meaningful way. It's also about being very clear about the training and development that's available. I do see lots of scope for confusion with course titles and names and acronyms. In the survey, in the NTTP survey, a lot of our staff, they didn't recognise the names of the courses that were there, but when they stated what they were the same thing, but people were calling them different things. So I do think there's quite a bit of scope for confusion and some clarity needed around that. We know this can't be a one-size-fits-all approach, and going out and actually meeting people where they are, often physically where they are, is really, really important and actually very much appreciated by staff as well. And I suppose my final point here is really that things take a lot longer than we expect. They really do take time. This is really the long game that we need to play here, but that perseverance and that clear, consistent messaging really does pay off. I've given the examples there of how we've managed to, with a lot of promotion, increase those numbers of people that are accessing resources that are available for people. And every conversation and interaction and workshop does create a ripple effect that spreads. And that's me. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think I've got about 15 minutes. Is that right? So I'll stick to it as much as I can. It was nice to hear Alison say that having a plan wasn't something that she had, because for me it was just taking the opportunities that presented themselves, really, whenever they did present themselves. So it has been fairly piecemeal, and the plan's kind of revealed itself along the way. So if it feels a little bit scattergun, in reality that's because it kind of has been to be perfectly honest, and I've had to learn on the fly and make adjustments as we've gone. So I'll try and cover as much as I can, but I'm happy to take any questions, and if you want to share email, I'm happy to chat to anybody about it as well. I'm going to take us back to like before I even started learning about trauma and stuff, just to give you a little bit of context as to why it became important for me personally, but also for us as an organisation. So I manage all of the community work for Sanctuary Scotland Housing Association. Sanctuary is one of the biggest registered social landlords in the country. We've got around about 11,000 homes all across Scotland, so across lots and lots, almost every local authority, I think, or the majority of them. And just over 8,000 of those are for social rent. And for me, I didn't have a housing background, and I wanted to be able to have more of I wanted housing to have more of an impact. And even just in raw figures, like if we break it down, something like 1 in every 500 people live in a sanctuary house in Scotland. And for me, I was like, that's the scale for possibility of social change there is massive. And I felt like housing has a responsibility on itself to do more in terms of contributing to social change. So that was really where this stuff kind of came in. So I'll talk a little bit about our journey and some of the stuff that's happened. It was really born out of me, to be perfectly honest, having a bit of a bee in me bonnet about housing and what housing did, and mostly in our either contribution towards the homelessness issues in the country or prevention of homelessness issues. And for me, it was really about this. It was like I was part of a housing association that was contributing to homelessness. I felt, because we were evicting tenants, or tenancies were failing, and I didn't feel like we were doing as much about it as we could. And really, this is the kind of the crux of it for me, that it's not just about stopping somebody losing their home, it's about helping somebody feel like they belong somewhere. And that really starts with helping them understand themselves and understand their lives, and having a staff force that is well equipped for helping people do that, and being empathetic in doing that as well, and actually being confident and skilled enough to be able to navigate some of those really complex situations that we deal with every single day. So it's really I use this as a little bit of a throwaway term, but I do kind of mean it. My aim here is to try and humanize housing. I think the housing sector and the housing system is very inhumane in many ways to everybody that is wrapped up in it, and I mean that for staff and for tenants. And I think that learning about trauma is a key facet in taking us towards that. So it is really about helping people start to feel like they belong and they understand themselves, so that they can have better lives and not just a roof over their heads. So some of the background, like my background is youth work and community development, and I just landed in housing. I never made a conscious decision to move into housing, but once I was in there, I saw a system that was very complicated. And really what I saw was a housing system that wasn't particularly working very well, that continued to apply housing solutions to housing issues. And that to me felt like an opportunity to do something different. So I put a proposal to my line manager as the director for Scotland. So I have quite a good kind of input into the way that management is. I sit on the senior management team, and I put a proposal to her that we should be looking at some of the stuff that we came up against differently, basically trying to take a community development, reflective and critical lens to some of the issues that we saw. And this was about like crisis point intervention for tenants, but also looking at some of the pressures that were faced by housing management, and really getting past just applying housing solutions to some of this. So I was lucky, like people have talked about funding. I was lucky to get funding to support some of this stuff. Some of it came through the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. Some of it came through Scottish Government. For those of you in big organisations, we also leveraged in money from our supply chain. I can talk about that a little bit later, but we've also, because it's been so successful, I've managed to bring in to convince people to put some of Sanctuary's general operational budget, so staff and budget and training budget, towards some of this stuff. But really it was founded because evictions and abandonments and tenancy failure costs the housing association money, and I didn't think that we were really looking at that. If anybody's if nobody's seen it, then there was a report done a few years ago by Shelter Scotland that looked at the cost of a tenancy failure in Scotland, and it prices it at around about £15,000 per tenancy failure. So to me, it was like a huge amount of money that was being lost for something that was unsuccessful. Nobody wins whenever a tenancy fails. Everybody loses. The system loses money. People's lives are completely, almost damaged. Damaged massively. There's huge trauma put upon people by a tenancy failure, and it costs a whole load of money. So it was like, how do we change that? one of the first steps that I took was to try and bring some lived experience into the organization. So the team that I manage is a team of 8. Half of it does general community work and half of it focuses on tenancy sustainment. And tenancy sustainment in a kind of broader sense, not how housing thinks of it, about this sense of belonging, about helping people sustain tenancies because they realize that their life is not unrepairable, and we try to support people to be able to do that. And lived experience was something that we didn't have in the organization, certainly not outwardly anyway. People weren't coming to us telling us that they had it. Wasn't often talked about, so we made a point of bringing it in. So the team that deal the half of my team that deal with tenancy sustainment all have lived experience of homelessness, either from the point of view of a tenant, lived experience of homelessness, or lived experience of the eviction process from the point of view of a tenant, because that felt like something that we really had to bring in. What a lot of the work that I was doing was kind of focusing on person-centered stuff, but we weren't having as much impact as we were hoping that we would have. And actually, I got the chance, and I'm going back probably almost 5 years at this point because it was pre-COVID, and I just on the off chance I seen an event happening in Alloa, and I don't know, can you make Shamila blush? I probably can, but Shamila was the main speaker at that, and I'd never met her before. I'd never heard about her. I'd heard about ACEs and done a bit of work around that, but it seemed like an interesting event. And I went along to the town hall in Alloa, and Shamila talked very eloquently about her own experience of trauma and the impact that it had on her. And it was like a light bulb moment for me. It really made us realize that trauma was a huge player in all of the situations that we saw every single day in housing. That people weren't, it's not that they weren't engaging or they weren't capable, it's that they felt they couldn't. And that for me kind of, yeah, like I said, it really turned things around for us. So that set us down the path of trying to understand trauma from a housing perspective, and then thinking about like what does trauma informed look like in a housing context. And fundamentally, not to boil it down to, it's much more complex than this, but really trust and relationships, reliable trust and relationships. And from a housing perspective, we have the chance consistently every single day to build relationships with people, and we were never taking that opportunity. And I mean that between staff and tenant, but also out in the communities as well. Did we create the kind of the situation where community members could build reliable trust and relationships with each other as well? And again, I feel like there's an onus on housing to recognize that, but then to do something about that as well. So in terms of the trauma informed work, the first step for me after seeing Shamila talk was like, I was just so struck by what she talked about that I just went and spoke to almost everybody that would listen to us about it. And in fact, some people that wouldn't listen, but I just made a point of like banging on about it for ages. And I think that's one of the things that I have to say, like, it has been hard work, very rewarding, but you have to be relentless, because at this point it was kind of just me. But I made a point of talking about, all of the cost of not understanding this stuff. Like the business case that I always say to people is kind of summed up in one line. And it's like, well, what happens if we do nothing here? Because I think you can see the example of what happens if we do nothing in the situation that we're in now. So why don't we get ahead of the curve and do something about this? And I spoke to exec members, like after I'd spoken to my director. Sanctuary Scotland is part of a much bigger organisation across the UK. So I just said, can I just go straight to executive and talk to them about this? Because I think it's important. I mean, boss was fine about it. I got a very receptive response from them, be perfectly honest. And actually, looking back, it was much easier than I thought. So I went to them and I talked about Shamila's presentation. I talked to them about the stuff that I'd learned, and they were really interested. So from the very start, I had exec buy-in and actually sponsorship from the kind of highest level of the organisation about the importance of this, which was really crucial, to be honest. I mean, the sponsorship didn't amount to any money at that point, but it did amount to freedom to go and have conversations, and difficult conversations with people, to challenge the narrative that we have in housing and challenge the way that we do things and the systems that we do. It also freed up space for me to say, if I can do as much as I can with no money, will you let us do it? And they did. So I worked really closely with Shamila and the team at RLP for a while, and we created a lot of staff training workshops and awareness sessions. And basically, I just went out and did that across the whole of the country. So we've got 4 sites across the country where we have offices. We've got them in Glasgow, Cumbernauld, Dundee, and Aberdeen, and all of our stock is kind of managed from them. So I went out and spoke to staff. I delivered kind of trauma awareness sessions and the ACE aware stuff as well. And actually the feedback from staff was like, yes, I get this. This is our every single day. And actually it's not just once a day this is happening, it is multiple times a day. So there was a real groundswell immediately from staff to say, like, God, this is seriously important to us. Like this is having such a massive effect, and it plays into every situation that we deal with every single day. So we want more. Staff were really hungry to really learn about this and hear about it. What I didn't think about at that point in time, and I don't know, things work out for a reason. I don't know if I'd done it the other way, it would have worked as well, but I didn't talk about vicarious trauma and the impact on staff. That kind of came later. What I would say is I would probably do it differently now and focus on staff first. But I actually think it did is it set the ground for staff to be able to understand what impact it had on them by talking about it for tenants first and foremost. So we've got now a whole range of different training options for staff. So unlike Alison, like we decided to make it mandatory just in terms of an awareness session. So every new member of staff that comes into Sanctuary Scotland goes on like a very brief overview of like an hour of like what is trauma, what impact does it have on your body, what kind of impact does it have on behavior, and then we kind of contextualize it in housing because we think it is that important because it is something that happens all of the time that we felt it had to be made mandatory. So staff there's an online module that I used to deliver, but has now been taken on by our learning and development team. So it's delivered by Sanctuary staff who I have no jurisdiction over, but the organisation thought it was important enough that they wanted to put the money into that. But we also have like brief modules where staff can go in and learn things. We call them Learning 10s, and it's just like to go through a PowerPoint presentation that's a real basic introduction with a view to moving on to a more in-depth training session as well. I go around and I do sessions for our operatives. So again, Alison talked a little bit about the people on the front line, like your joiners, your gas engineers, your plumbers. This has been quite a recent development for us because from my point of view, I was looking at it and thinking, housing officers get into certain homes, they see certain things, but actually the guys on the front line who have to go in and do compliance stuff, safety checks, they see some of the houses that you would never get into. And so I delivered a session for them. And the real view with that session was to deliver it similar to the housing, but to allow them to shape it. The whole point was that this is a totally different audience who dealt with things in a different way and who dealt with different situations. It wasn't their job necessarily to do the people side of it. But in a 2-hour session with them, I was completely blown away by the way that a lot of them worked in a trauma-informed way already. They just didn't have the language. So the next step for that is to bring some of those guys back together to change the content, to use their case studies. So we're using actual case studies from operatives instead of housing ones to talk about why understanding trauma is really, really important. And I heard some amazing stuff from the guys on the front line, that like how agile they have to be in a moment sometimes to react whenever they just recognize that something isn't right. Simple stuff like leaving a door open whenever there's only a female in the house when there's 5 guys going in and doing our repairs. Like they know this and they see it and they just didn't have the language. And so that's going to be quite huge, I think, for us. And that's going to be a major focus for me over the next year. Because it wasn't that they weren't confident to do it. Like I say, they just didn't have the language to do it with. In terms of like some of the more formal stuff, I made a real push to include trauma-informed practice and trauma skilled in our equality, diversity and inclusion strategy. So this runs across the whole of Sanctuary Group, across the whole of the UK, and it is now embedded in all of our in our equality and diversity strategy. Being trauma-informed is something that Sanctuary has kind of set as something that we want to do. In terms of the CI team, so that stands for Community Investment, that's the team that I manage. That was the team where I had the most control. So I spoke to our recruitment teams and HR, and all of the roles in my team are now formally trauma informed. So if you're part of my team, you need to go through all of the trauma informed sessions to a higher level than just the kind of general frontline staff would. And I can share job descriptions with people if you would like that kind of thing, and I can share some of the training stuff that we've done with them. But again, it felt really important that like to kind of walk the walk, that if I was asking other people to do this, then my team had to be definitely doing this. And so I wanted to be committed to making sure that my team were, almost champions of this from the very beginning. If a staff member didn't know where to turn with some of it, then they could always turn to my team. And that has meant a lot of work that I've invested into my team, but also aligning them with people who are experts in this. So we work still very closely with RLP. We get a load of input and a load of guidance from Shamila and her team on how best to do this. We've looked at policies, we've looked at procedures, we've looked at job descriptions, we've looked at rent letters, all sorts of it, and really critically thought about how would this land from somebody who has experienced trauma and how can we be better at doing it. It's led to quite a lot of grant funding success for us, and that's not a reason to do something, but I do think in a competitive world where we're all trying to do stuff, it became really important to include the language of trauma and our understanding of the impact that we can have if we understand trauma in grant funding. And it made a massive difference for some of the grant funding stuff that we've done. And actually in conversations with suppliers, they are really interested in this different type of approach that a housing association, or I guess any organization can take, because their money goes further. There's not so much interest now in just painting parks and painting church halls and putting on fun days and stuff, because the conversation I had with them was like, that stuff's great and do it, please do it, because people need that. You have to have those bright spots in your life. But if you're building homes somewhere or you're wanting to invest in communities, invest in the future of those communities. Don't just build a park and think that will solve everything. And that's been a really positive conversation with like private sector. And I think that is a really exciting area of development for Scotland generally, to be honest. Like I think the more the people in this room who are linked in some way to the private sector can start talking about trauma, I think that is where real social change can come, if we can bring in private investment and leverage in private investment. In terms of vicarious trauma, so like I say, this was something that kind of came a little bit later down the line, and it was like I had a conversation with a guy at one point, and he said something which completely changed my mind. And the sentence he said to us was the capacity of your staff to be trauma informed is intrinsically linked to their well-being. And as soon as he said it, I could not believe that I'd missed it, to be perfectly honest. And this is like, that idea, I had no plan. I was just kind of going along. But as soon as he said it, I realized I had a hell of a lot more work on my plate. And really, what I'd seen was staff who were totally ready and willing to work in a trauma-informed way. But the context of the job and the things they experienced prevented them from doing that. I think fundamentally, when you're asking people to be trauma-informed, you're asking them to be empathetic. And empathy is a finite resource. Like you simply cannot give and give and give. And I was watching amazing housing officers who were really up for this kind of battle walking away from the sector. And that to me was a real shame, because you weren't just losing a body, you were losing somebody who cared, somebody who was up for trying to change things, but they were burnt out because we weren't looking after them. And I think for us, critically looking at the way that we supported staff, what we never did was ask them why they needed wellbeing help in the first place. Sanctuary is very good at being reactive and saying, here's some mindfulness sessions, you can access counselling, you can do this, you can do that. But we never really asked the question, why do you need it in the first place? And so I went out and I spoke to staff all across the country, and actually the feedback from them was like, it's just good to have that conversation. Nobody ever asks us, why, what has contributed to us feeling this way. People always jump to the solution first. And so we've kind of gone right the way back, and we are looking at all of the things that people do every day that contributes to causing them trauma in their workplace. Because working on the front line in housing is really, really hard. You see some difficult stuff, and staff have to do some very, very difficult things as well. And it's had a massive impact on them. And I'm kind of determined that we can support people, because you need a well workforce to do all of this stuff. We had a bit of an evaluation done by Glasgow University on trauma-informed working with tenants who were at risk of losing their tenancy. And what we found is that working in a trauma-informed way redistributed the power between tenant and landlord, or rather, it redistributed the kind of the perception of power, because people who were about to lose their home felt like they had nothing. But what we were helping them understand by recognizing trauma and its impact is that they do have power, and it's not just about the housing association here, it's about them as well. And I can share that if people are interested. And then for me as well, like part of what we've had to do, and this is all tied up in the same thing, is that like by virtue of being professionals and having a job, we get access to events like today. We get to hear from amazing people. I got the chance to go and hear Shamila speak, but the people in the places where we had housing, who trauma was there every day, they never got this. And so we invested some of our community budget in taking this learning into communities as well, so that the community members themselves could go and have these conversations and they could learn about the impact of trauma, because like it really is everybody's business. And if we were only upskilling our workforce and only, you know, concentrating on the well-being of our workforce, then all we're doing is kind of just, you know, what's the word? We're just making sure that our power imbalance is staying there. So it was really important for us to invest in the community where we had housing as well. In terms of impact, I've now managed a team so it's 7.28 people, full-time equivalent posts across Sanctuary in Scotland. So we've got we've got some in Glasgow, got some in 2 sites in Glasgow, Cumbernauld, Aberdeen, Aberdeenshire. Sanctuary Group are also trying to look to replicate what we're doing in Scotland, down in England as well. To date, we've got 570 tenancies that have been supported that were at the highest risk of failure, and only 4 of those have resulted in eviction, which has been like a real, you know, a very definite impact on our performance as an organisation. We've started to really focus on staff well-being, and this idea of the question, you know, like what causes difficulty in the first place, not jumping to solve it, but what actually causes it. Because often just having that conversation informally, not just as part of one-to-ones, is all that staff need. And the feedback is that from staff has been that has been very positive for them. We've seen a real impact on rent arrears. We've seen them stabilising or reducing where we would ordinarily see them going up. We've seen better relationships with housing management for tenants, and we've been able to start addressing some complex issues with tenancies, because very rarely is only one thing going wrong for somebody. I always talk about rent arrears as a symptom of a much deeper malaise in somebody's life, but as a housing sector, what we actually do is we just treat that symptom. We chase the money and we don't get people well. Whereas if we can get people well, then they'll pay their rent. Like happy, healthy people pay their rent, but people that pay their rent aren't always happy and healthy. And I think that it's what we've got kind of back to front as a sector. Something that's really important for us is connection back into community and services is really key. One, we don't want to create a dependence, but one of the things that helps you have a good life is connection to other people. And so it's really important that the work around trauma is aimed towards connecting people back into community life so that they can have, like I say, a better life, and so that we can all start to regulate off each other, and there's a bigger picture at play here. And I have spoken to other housing associations about this, and there's a few of them that are actually trying to use the same model and approach that we're using. I'll just share a couple of quotes. I think this kind of stuff is always nice. You know, this is genuine feedback that we've got from tenants who we've been working alongside, and people who've came along to workshops about trauma. Just understanding yourself for the first time. I don't think anything beats that. You know, that is the point where you can start to recover and you can start to feel better and you can start to have a better life from that point. But it's really important that you can repair your relationship with yourself first before you start doing anything else. And so seeing this type of thing is really important to us. And for staff, you know, we're hearing things like without this work, they would have left their roles. It relieves the pressure on them. They recognise why they're struggling, things like that. So it does make a real difference for staff in their day-to-day as well. It's amazing to me whenever I get feedback from staff just saying like it's helped them stay in their job. In terms of learning and next steps, like for us, what we're finding is that taking a place-based approach is working really well for us. It's really important that you invest in that place, that you don't just invest in the just in tenants, and that's part of what my team does. It's about investment in that whole community. If you improve life in that whole community, then you improve life for tenants. Whereas if you only improve life for tenants, then that's the kind of limit of what you do, and there is a bigger game to play here. Taking trauma-informed approach to the housing and community connector role lightens the load on housing officers. It stops them being pushed out of their window of tolerance all of the time, because we can take up some of the slack, especially when dealing with complex cases or challenging services and things like that. One of the questions that I always get people to ask, and it's been great for us, and I would say to you, it's a good question to start. In the services that you deliver, what has been normalized that isn't normal? And when does caring get hard, and what's our response to that? Whenever I talk about like what's normalized that isn't normal, something that's normalized in housing is an eviction. Now, if you talk about an eviction, like that's not a normal thing, but it becomes a task in housing. And actually, just turning something like that into a task can be very damaging. And thinking about things in a trauma-informed way and taking trauma-informed approach unnormalizes that. And I think that's when we can start to really tackle the impact that it can have. We think more readily about this interdependence of staff and tenants. We aren't two separate groups. We interact all of the time, and so we have to recognize that, and investing in both has been really, really important. We've made sure that we've got champions across the business. This has really helped us. Some staff are really up for it, some staff aren't. That's the reality. I work with where the energy is, because I think, if you're not coming with us now, you're going to get dragged along in the future at some point, or you'll leave your job and I'll get somebody better. I think that's, you kind of have to work with where the energy is whenever you've got such a big task in front of you. Connection back in the community is key. And fundamentally, a safe home in a community where you feel you belong is fundamental to a good life. One of the things I always say is that, as a housing association, surely what we want are happy, healthy tenants in their homes for longer, and happy, healthy staff in their jobs for longer, because everybody wins in that. And I think trauma-informed practice has been a real fundamental for us in being able to work towards that. In terms of next steps, I'm going to be starting to roll this out across the whole of Scotland, the whole of the UK. It'll be upskilling, changing some of the training, doing a lot of the operatives work, and really finding other champions across Sanctuary UK who are up for this kind of this change as well. Putting staff well-being and the impact of vicarious trauma right at the centre of that is really, really important, and sharing some stories from staff. Like, there's some hard stuff that I've heard, some really hard stuff, but unless we talk about it, then we can't do anything about it. And actually just appreciating that staff come up against some very difficult stuff all of the time. Just talking about that has been really, really important. We've linked it to safeguarding, staff confidence around safeguarding, and making sure that kind of thing is tied in. We make sure that any new staff get refresher training, that any staff who come in get the training as new. We do refresher because we kind of presume that people just remember it, because it's my day-to-day. It's not a housing officer's day-to-day, so we have to go back and keep this a live conversation. And then 2025 is really going to be looking at this more formal implementation of the roadmap, and appreciating that we've came very far in the last 5 years, but we've got a way to go. And there's no end point to this, and I think the roadmap, whenever it came out, I looked at it and I was like, oh my god, I've got so much more work to do, but up for the challenge. And I think that kind of formal roadmap will make a massive difference for us in the formalizing and having a plan this time. Now I'm keen to have a plan whenever we push it on a bit more. And that's it. I don't know if I went over my time, sorry.